Welcome to Business Beyond the Mic, where we join Carly Van Heerden, CEO and founder of We Edit Podcasts. Together, let's uncover the art of podcasting.
Hey everyone, and welcome to Business Beyond the Mic. I'm your host, Carly Van Heerden. Today on the show, we welcome Brittany Hodak. Now, Brittany is an award-winning entrepreneur, author, and customer experience speaker who has delivered keynotes across the globe to organizations including American Express and the United Nations. She has worked with some of the world's biggest brands and entertainers, including Walmart, Disney, Katy Perry, and Dolly Parton. She founded and scaled an entertainment startup to 8 figures before exiting, and she is the former chief experience officer of experience.com. Now, Forbes said about her debut book, Creating Superfans, if you have customers, you need this book, period. Now, it's such great timing to have Brittany on the show because this first week of October is Customer Experience Week, and Brittany is the expert on all things customer experience. During our conversation, she shares the initial obstacles that she faced and why it took so long for her to launch her podcast in the first place. She also dives into her advice on creating evergreen content and how her appearance on Shark Tank continues to influence the success of her podcast today. Brittany is an absolute wealth of information on everything from podcast content strategy, how to decide on the right sponsorships for your show, and what it really looks like when your message truly resonates with your audience. So stay tuned as Brittany walks us through how to eliminate the chaos from your podcasting process and reminds us why it is so important to up the caliber of each new episode that you release. I can't wait to share this all with you, so join us in our conversation. Brittany Hodak, welcome to Business Beyond the Mic. I'm so excited to have you here.
Thank you, Carly. I'm so excited to be here.
Well, since you are the expert on all things super fandom, why don't you start us off by telling us about yourself, your brand, your business, and of course, your podcast?
Sure. So I was an accidental entrepreneur, and after almost 15 years in the music industry, sort of accidentally discovered that I love customer experience. I am obsessed with helping businesses think about how they can use customer experience as a differentiator to stand out in whatever industry they're in. Because I truly believe that we are living in an experience economy. Experience is everything, and everything is experience. It's the biggest factor that separates you from all of your competitors, current and future. And so I have spent the past several years of my life nerding out, if I'm being totally honest, on all things customer experience to study and understand what the best brands in the world do, whether they're very small brands or huge brands, what it is that they're doing to make their customers fall in love with them so that all of the rest of us can learn and adopt those best practices.
Oh, that's amazing. Because that's the thing. What better way to learn than to look at those who are doing it exceptionally well? I mean, yeah.
Well, and one of the things that I really have found from doing that is a lot of times when people talk about marketing or they talk about branding, or even if they talk about customer experience, they look at the titans, right? They look at Amazon, they look at Disney, they look at the Ritz-Carlton. And I hate to break it to you, but there is a very, 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 very high probability that your brand is not Disney. You're not Amazon. You're not Nike. You're not the Ritz-Carlton until you are at the place to where your logo is enough to evoke an emotion in someone and make them feel something about you based on just hearing your name or seeing your logo. That is not where your focus should be. Your brand is your employees. Your brand is the way you treat your customers, the way you show up in every single interaction. And I feel like that doesn't get nearly enough airtime because it's not as sexy. Like everybody would rather be like, oh, look at this like cool new thing that Airbnb is doing. Like I'm going to do that too. But until your brand is at that level, like you don't need LeBron James teaching you to play basketball if you have never played basketball. Like that is not the coach you need. That is not what you need to be looking to. And so what I really get excited about when I talk about about customer experience is the little things that often get overlooked because we're not teaching every single employee that they are the chief experience officer of our business, that they are the ones determining whether or not someone comes back, what someone says to their friend. And, so that's where I really geek out and nerd out, because you're right. Like, a lot of times if you're just starting out, the inclination is to look at like the best in the world and say, how do I be like them? But you can't use someone else's chapter 100 to help inform your chapter 1 or chapter 5.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's so perfect. You really hit the nail on the head there. But with all this wealth of information that you had, what inspired you to launch your podcast? What was that journey like for you?
So I put off launching a podcast for a long time. It was one of those things that people had asked me to do. So I am a speaker and an author. My primary business model is traveling around the country, speaking at events and doing what I call intentional experience design days, which are these like really fun one-day intensives where I work with business owners and leaders to really overhaul the experience for their customers and their employees. And I honestly like put off doing a podcast for a long time just because I was overwhelmed by the logistics of it. Where am I going to find time to schedule all these interviews, to meet the right people, to do all of the back end stuff? It just felt really overwhelming. But I launched a book at the beginning of this year called Creating Superfans. And so many people who have seen me speak would come up to me and say, why don't you have a podcast? I wish you had a podcast. I want to listen to a podcast. And so like many podcasters, I sort of reluctantly said, okay, let me figure this out and let me figure out where that fits in, because most of the content that I had been creating was aimed toward the people who would hire me. It was aimed towards the executive team. It was aimed towards the meeting planners, because those were the people making the hiring decisions. But my book is written for employees. It's written for the people actually implementing the experiences on the front lines with the customers. So I had to figure out, who is my podcast for? Where does it fit? What is the message? Who am I ultimately serving? And how does it fit into the larger mix of my business? And so by taking the time to figure all that out and do that work, I was able to feel very confident when I finally did launch the podcast that it was the right show with the right content at the right time that would really serve my audience well.
What would you say those goals were with your podcast when you launched? Like, were you aiming to like create a new audience or integrate it, would you say? Or what kind of goals did you set for yourself?
So it was really integrated. It was to give people who had seen me speak at an event. They, went to their company sales rally, or they went to an industry event or an association conference, and they said, wow, I really am inspired to care about customer experience now. I wanted to give them an ongoing resource. I wanted to give them a touch point where they could continue to get those insights and feel inspired and know how to take actions to better serve customers after I left the stage. And that was like, to be totally honest, that was not an audience that I had given a lot of thought to serving before.
Yeah. So, I mean, when you get these surprising things that happen, how do you respond to that? Like, do you nurture that audience in a different way, or have you kind of helped that, like, encompass that all into building your brand like even further?
So, something that I think is so interesting about podcasts is they've got such a long tail. So I had a business that I ran for almost a decade before selling it. And in 2014, I recorded an episode of Shark Tank.
Oh,
and that episode aired in 2015 for the first time. And then again on network TV as a rerun on the network in 2015. And then it went into syndication, and it's syndicated on MSNBC and CNBC primarily in the United States, but then in like almost 100 countries around the world. Wow. And something that I had not given thought to was the fact that forever people would be seeing that episode, and then to them that it was new. Like, it didn't matter that I recorded it 3 or 5 or 7 years ago, like it was new. And so I've seen over the past several years every single time the episode airs, thousands of people go to my website every single time. Like I can look at my Google Analytics and tell you exactly when an episode of Shark Tank aired, not just in the United States, but around the world, because I see those spikes, because people are watching TV and then they're on their phone and they're like, oh, I wonder what happened. And so that perspective, I think, also made me overthink what I wanted to do with the podcast, because I just kept thinking, well, podcast episodes are forever. And I mean, obviously you can like pull them down if you need to, but for the most part, the idea is that you publish this content and then it's evergreen. So I really wanted to focus on serving an audience with information that would be relevant, regardless of if they listen to it the week that it comes out or 2 or 3 years later. And I think that was another part of thinking through, my ad strategy, what I wanted to do for sponsorships, the types of things that I want to talk about, the types of guests that I'm willing to invite on, and sort of put my name behind with this inferred endorsement of having them on the show. And so I think that perspective made me think about not just how am I serving the clients who listen to my podcast now, but how am I curating something that is going to be evergreen. And, obviously that doesn't have to be the case for anybody. Like I have plenty of friends who do amazing daily podcasts where they talk about the news, they talk about current events, and that's a very like quick burn. Sometimes they even pull them down after several months. But for me, I wanted to create something that regardless of when somebody found it, it was a really strong point of entry for them into the experience of me and my brand in this world of talking about creating superfans.
Yeah, exactly. But that makes sense because every podcasting experience is actually quite personal. It depends on the relationship that you have with your existing audience or whoever you think is going to be a new part of your audience. So it just depends on like that even influences, I would say, how often you're publishing. Like you're saying with that news one, it's daily because there's something new happening every day. With somebody else whose evergreen content is the focus, it could be every other week, it could be bi-weekly, it'll all stay out there. So then what kind of metrics would you say you use to see if your podcast episodes are hitting home with your audience? How do you know that you're heading in the right direction?
So obviously the number of downloads, the number of people listening and engaging is a really good metric. For me, another really great metric that honestly I hadn't thought about before I started was the amount of unsolicited feedback I get. So when people either who I know in real life or who I only know online, show up in my DMs or show up in my inbox to tell me how much they loved an episode, or they're tagging me in shares on social media, that's another really great way for me to say, okay, this is resonating. This wasn't just something that somebody listened to on a walk or had playing in the background while they were doing laundry. Somebody enjoyed this enough to send me a note, send it to other people, and share it online. So I think the engagement aspect is something very important. Another really good metric that, again, was not on my radar. So I did, after I started, I probably had like 7 or 8 episodes up, and I was like, you know what, we're going to do seasons. We're going to do, my life was just too crazy and busy. I've done 45 in-person speaking events this year, like all over the world. So I was like, I cannot continue to produce a show every single week. There needs to be a break. So we decided we would do 20 episodes and call that the first season, and then take a break for 3 or 4 months, and then, get ahead, like record enough episodes to really give us a buffer, and then go back out with season 2. I had dozens and dozens of people replying to like random things, being like, when's your podcast coming back? When's your podcast coming back? Like, when is it starting up again? And that was another, indication of like, oh, people actually are listening to this and are noticing that it's been 6 Tuesdays since we put out an episode.
Yeah, that's that's amazing, because then they're sitting there in anticipation, waiting for a new episode to be published. So then, if you're doing these seasons, when you're kind of thinking through that, obviously it made strategic sense for you in your business and your speaking. But what about if you have like a fear of, oh my gosh, if I'm going to skip 6 Tuesdays, will that affect my listenership? Like, how did you manage that part of it?
So I was very intentional of, once we decided we were going to do seasons, I started referring to the episodes as like, oh, in this new episode of season 1, when there were 3 episodes left in the season, everywhere we were talking about it in my newsletter, on social media, even in the episodes, I was saying, oh, we've got 3 more episodes this season, and then we're going to take a break. And we didn't say exactly how long the break was going to be because, in full disclosure, we did not know. We were still trying to figure out what we wanted the vibe to be for the second season, who the guests were going to be, what I wanted to do for the sponsorship. Not because I had an amazing sponsor for the entire first season, and they very likely would have sponsored it for season 2, but I wanted a different sponsor because I just didn't want it to become like, oh, I'm doing this show for them. Like it felt to me like, okay, I've done over 20 episodes with the same sponsor, with the same message. Let me figure out what I want to do for the second season now. So we took a bit of a break. And when we came back, we were very intentional about the messaging and have been able to balance this guest schedule very well. So we're only doing 15 episodes in the second season. And the reason we're doing that is because that will end in December right before the holidays. And then we'll pick back up again in the new year. So we actually looked at the calendar and said, how many episodes do we want to have? How many guests should be authors? How many should be practitioners of CX? How many people doing really cool, like high profile things that do we want to do? How many episodes am I recording solo on my own to talk about one thing or another? So Alex, who's on my team, who produces my podcast, among many other things, she and I sat down and really got intentional about what we wanted that to look like ahead of launching that second season, which, by the way, is something that I recommend that people do before they launch their first season, because it turns out it is very helpful.
Yes. I mean, I haven't even thought of that, because when you think of podcasting, starting a podcast, you're like, okay, let's get the guests. Okay, what am I going to talk about? Okay, let's go. You're not thinking that was so strategic about like what type of guest, how do you want to space it? Where do you want to launch? When do you want to have your breaks? It's such key information to do that. And like you said, just to sit down and strategize about it beforehand is genius.
Well, and it makes it a lot easier for the guests too, because every single guest who I've interviewed for this season, I've been able to say, is there a certain date we should target to put this out that works really well for you? And obviously with authors, I've done things that have come out on the days that their book come out. And for big brands, aligning it around exciting things that are happening in their marketing campaigns. So being able to not say like, oh, I've got to do an episode right now because I need something to come out in 3 days because they come out every Thursday and it's already Monday. Like not having that chaoticness has been really fantastic. I feel like the caliber of the episodes is even higher, and the overall experience of somebody listening to it, like if someone discovers the podcast and listens to several episodes in a row, there's going to be a lot more variety and a lot more intentionality in the order than last season, which was pretty much like, okay, who did we talk to this week? Let's get the episode up.
Right. Yeah. And that's the thing. You have to think about that repetitiveness. For you as the host or even the guest, it's a one-time thing, or that episode, you're just doing that today. But somebody who's listening might do, like you're saying, listen to 3 in a row. And if you're just saying the same things over and over, they're like, okay, what did I even gain from that last one now? If it's just copy and paste of the previous. But that's very good advice. Thanks, Brittany. I was just thinking, let's hop into sponsorship since you mentioned it. What does that process look like? If somebody's thinking about doing a sponsor for their show or monetizing in other ways, what advice would you give them?
So my advice would be, think about who you want to align yourself with. This is your personal brand. This is your podcast. It is very important that you can stand behind what you're promoting, because obviously if you can't, like, all of your credibility goes out the window. So think about who an ideal sponsor would be for you. The first episode of my podcast was sponsored by a speaking client of mine, a CRM called Total Expert. And I love everything about the company. I love what they stand for. I've gotten to know their leadership team and their marketing team and even many of their customers very, very well from events that I've done. So for me, that was a no-brainer to ask them to sponsor the first season. And I honestly had no idea what to price it at. So I came up with a number that I thought sounded fair on both sides. And they said, yes, we would love to sponsor it. I was able to interview their CEO in one of my episodes and members of their marketing team for a special event themed episode at the end of the season. So that was a really fun thing to do. For this second season, I am taking a page out of a playbook of a mutual friend of ours, Rory Vaden, who is the co-founder of a group called Brand Builders Group and the host of a podcast called The Influential Personal Brand. And I have been a client of Rory's and Brand Builders Group for years now, and they have a very generous referral affiliate program. And I know that several podcasters have made substantial revenue from their affiliate link for Brand Builders Group. And again, going back to what I said before, I would never want to endorse or sponsor something that I don't fully believe in. But because Brand Builders Group has been so transformational for me in my journey, I said, hey, would you guys be interested in sponsoring the second season of the show? And I, instead of charging the same fee that I charged up front to the sponsor from the first season, I went in with a much lower sponsorship cost, but I'm making a higher percentage on the back end because anyone who signs up is doing so through an affiliate link. And so it's going to be really interesting to see how the overall revenue comes out on the sponsorship side at the end of the season. And again, because there is such a long tail with podcasts, like in that first season, I cashed the check. It paid for, all of my expenses and then some. But for the second season, I will theoretically be earning revenue forever because people who listen to the show that are qualified prospects for Brand Builders Group will check it out and they'll go to the affiliate link that I mentioned. And if they sign up, I'll participate in that revenue share.
Right. And that's amazing because then it's kind of like a recurring thing or evergreen way for you to get an income stream from your podcast, which is awesome. Yeah, that's great. I love that you had both those examples because now people can see what it takes to have either one. And it's actually ends up just being a conversation with your potential sponsor that you don't have to be worried about, oh, how's this going to work? You just open up that conversation. Like you said, you decide on something that you think is reasonable for both sides. And then you just start the dialogue and you get your result in the end, which is, sounds perfect.
Yeah. And
to
I think
me.
two other notes on that, those two things don't have to be mutually exclusive. So if you're listening to this show right now and you're like, oh, I love the idea of like recurring income, but I need income now. If I'm going to do this podcast, I need to be able to pay for it now. So those two things don't have to be mutually exclusive. You can obviously have more than one sponsor. So you might want to structure a deal where you say, I have one sponsor who's paying me a fixed sponsorship fee, and then another where I'm making money on the back end through an affiliate or referral relationship. And then the second thing that I want to say is you can also be intentional about promoting your own offerings in your podcast. A really great example of this, a friend of mine, John Acuff, has a podcast that I love. It's called All It Takes Is a Goal. And he very often promotes his own products and his podcast, but in the ad space. Like he's not just talking about it. It's today's episode of the podcast is sponsored by me and my new book. And so he's very good about doing that. And so, oh, you've got this community that I can join. Oh, you've got a new book. Oh, you've got an event that you're doing. And so I think a lot of times we take it for granted that like if somebody is listening to the podcast, they know everything that we're doing. They know what's going on in our world, but they don't. People are busy. They have so much going on. So don't be afraid to be your own sponsor if you don't have sponsors, or even if you do, to promote things. Just make sure, like we were talking about before, that it's something that's going to age well as the episode continues to live on beyond its initial release.
Right. And that's like you're saying there, you are the host of the show. People are tuning in to find out what you're up to too, not just the guests that you're bringing on, because if they're coming from your audience that you've already created, that they're there to listen to what you have to offer as well. So don't be shy to, promote what you're doing too, and let them in on the secrets that you're sharing with the world, which is, perfect. So when you're thinking about approaching these sponsors, what are your thoughts about whether or not your audience is big enough, or what do you have enough super fans for somebody to be interested in sponsoring a show?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think you should always be thinking, what value do I provide? And even if you don't have a huge audience, if you have a highly engaged audience who is likely to be the right fit for that potential sponsor, then you should absolutely talk to them. If you know that the people who are going to be listening to the show are the people who love you and know you and who you anticipate will be listening to the show are good potential customer fits for someone, they could be a great potential sponsor. Think about, you want that Venn diagram of the people that you're going to be connecting to and the types of customers that that company wants. Like, you want that Venn diagram to be as close to a circle as possible. Like, you want it to be a lot of overlap. And if you don't have a big audience, or you don't know who is going to be listening, you're like, I'm sort of throwing spaghetti at the wall to see what sticks, I don't know, then that might be an indication that you should be talking to somebody who's like a much more broad advertiser, somebody who appeals to wide swaths of the population and is looking for more generalized opportunities to reach customers, rather than like a hyper targeted audience where you can say, all right, if you need 27-year-olds who drive Jeeps and love to knit and live in, Milwaukee, like, I am the only place that they come for podcasts, right? So it's a little bit about knowing how you're adding the most value to an advertiser.
Yeah, that's right. I just pictured that in my brain. Somebody who drives a Jeep and loves to knit.
I mean,
it can
diverse,
happen.
right? Those Gen Zers, you can't put them in boxes. They're very diverse.
Yeah, totally. So
I don't even know if 27 would be Gen Z or millennial, but anyway, you get the idea. Clearly that was a off the top of my head example, but it's important to know who the audience is that you have or that you're trying to get in. One of the things that I talk about in my book, Creating Superfans, is when we try to attract everyone, we end up engaging no one. So you've got to know who it is that your show is perfect for. And obviously there will be spillover. Obviously there will be people who aren't like that ideal customer avatar, and that's fine. But rather than trying to do a little bit for everybody all over the place, you need to stick to that one ideal customer so that people know what your show is about and they don't get confused.
Right. Like you're talking about, you have to find the ones who's going to wear the merchandise, the t-shirts after the concert, and the ones who are going to tell their friends to listen to whatever you're putting out. Those are the ones you want to create and target. Yeah, that's amazing.
Absolutely.
So Brittany, what do you see as next for your podcast? Like, do you have any big plans and new things for the future of your podcast?
One of the things that I think is really interesting is when people go on live podcast tours and they have live studio audiences. I'm definitely not at the level to do that yet, but because I'm on the road so much, I have been thinking about what that could be like, how I could integrate recording a podcast into an event that I'm doing with hundreds of people. Because like I said, I'm going to be doing close to 65 events this year. How fun might it be to come up with an idea where I could capture something live and continue to add value to both the people in the room and the people tuning in? So that's something fun that I want to figure out for maybe 2024, 2025.
That sounds amazing. I think you're going to have way more fun with that than you even imagine. It'll be good.
I think it would be a blast.
Yeah, totally. Well, I think we are getting to that point where we want to do the quick fire 4 and just kind of pick your brain for whatever pops to mind. I'm going to ask these questions and then you just tell us what pops in mind, right? So first one, how has the podcast changed the way you do business or even changed your life?
Such a great question. I would say having the podcast has been a really great way for me to open doors that otherwise would have been difficult to open. So getting to a CEO or an executive who I think is somebody that should like be friends with me and know me and maybe work with me, but me just reaching out and saying that would probably be met with like, wait, who are you again? Why are you reaching out to me? But when I say, hi, I'm an author and a podcast host, and I would love to interview you for my podcast, which then, oh, by the way, will be shared on all of my socials and going out to my newsletter, then it's a really, really great way to get that first meeting with someone.
Right. Exactly. That's how we met.
Exactly. There we go.
And then second one is, what are the top 3 tools as a podcaster that you use?
Great question. I would say, obviously, We Had a Podcast is a wonderful tool to use. My producer, Alex, has recently started using a program called Cast Magic that does a lot of AI stuff. So it helps like find social moments in the show to share, and we'll put those together, and does some of the like metadata stuff too to help. And then I think the third tool is having a really good microphone. So I'm just recording this with a Yeti mic right now, but there are some people that I love. I'm not gonna say the name, but there is an author who I recently discovered, and he was a guest on somebody else's podcast, and I like actually watched that episode on YouTube and read his book, and then I was so excited that he had a podcast, and it's like very really he does like 3 episodes a week, and they're all short episodes, and I was like, this is great. So I immediately subscribed to the podcast, start downloading them, and the audio quality was horrible, like unlistenable. And I'm like, this is a guy who is on TV all the time. He's got millions of followers. How has nobody said, yo, your podcast is impossible to listen to? And I'm not even like an audio snob at all, but it is unlistenable. And so I would say, if there's one thing that you're investing in, even if you buy like a $30 microphone on Amazon, like get a mic that is built for podcasting so that your listeners don't have to like struggle and strain to listen to your show.
Honestly, I'm 100% behind you on that one. Like since the beginning of starting my company, learning, like listening to people trying to transcribe an episode where you can't hear what they're saying is like, okay, this is great and fun. Oh my gosh. I agree. So that's and your number 3. It's one of those things
that like once you lose somebody, like you've lost them forever. I talk in my book about, I think the number one threat that every business faces is apathy. It's people being like, meh, and then they like move on with their lives. And having bad quality audio is, I think, the number one thing that's going to make somebody maybe not even just apathetic, maybe like straight up angry. And then you lose them as a listener.
Yeah, you don't want those 3 stars because they're not going to do anything for you.
Exactly.
Oh, so you answered question number 3 with a non-negotiable investment, the mic. And now question number 4, if money and time are not a factor, what would be next for your podcast?
If money and time weren't a factor, I would do every interview in person with my guest in whatever their location was. So I have this really fun idea that I may do in a future season of the podcast where it's like me secret shopping and like rating the customer experience in real time. But either like for brands that I love or like emerging brands or super famous brands or whatever, like I think it would be really fun to do like an investigative type podcast of like, I'm going to go to 6 grocery stores today and like, we're going to like listen along as I try to buy the exact same thing at 6 different grocery stores and we see how the experience is different. So I think something like that would be really super fun. Or doing like the in-person, like I love watching all of the podcasts that, places like Spotify have like massively overpaid for, where you're like, oh, you're in your beautiful like $6 million studio with people that you've flown in on a private jet. Like, I think that would be fun too.
Yeah, honestly,
I
my
think I can
husband
get behind being like a bougie high-end podcast host with unlimited budget.
Well, my husband's such a fan of Cameron Haynes, and he does that. He flies his guests in, they go do all this good stuff, and then they eventually sit down to have a podcast. So you've got this incredible relationship that you've built over the time that you spend with your guest, and just makes for such rich content in the end. But yeah,
I think that would be amazing. And like, imagine, like, for somebody who talks about experiences, like the delta in that experience of like, you know, hey, click on this Zoom link for my pod. Well, we don't use Zoom. I use Riverside, which is another great tool that I really love for podcasts. So Riverside FM. But the difference between like, hey, click on this Riverside FM link, and hey, so we're going to have someone pick you up at the airport and bring you to the studio where we're going to have this like amazing, you know, Michelin starred chef lunch and then go climb a mountain and whatever. Like, it just, again, if time and money were no option, yes, I would turn it into a lifestyle podcast experience.
Totally. I can also imagine you as the secret shop. I used to work at a clothing store when I was in high school, and we'd always get so nervous when the secret shoppers were to arrive that day, and like you'd just be on your best behavior. So I can just imagine you popping out with a mic. Hey, I was your secret shopper today. How do you think you did?
Yeah. Or like the exit interviews, like, you know, like when people vote and they've got the people with the microphone and they're like, who did you vote for? Why did you vote for them? Like, if it was just me doing exit interviews with customers, like, hey, so how was your time in that store? Like, how I see that you've got 3 bags. Tell me what you bought and why. And did Judy help you? What was Judy like? Yeah, that would be fun.
Talk about incredibly fast feedback for that business. That's amazing. Oh, Brittany.
Well, maybe we'll add that. We'll make that season 5. Maybe we can do it together, Carly. You and I can be
popping out everywhere.
Exactly. Yes.
Oh my gosh. Oh, well, I've had an amazing time with you today on the show, Brittany. So I just wanted to say thanks for taking the time to help our podcasters and teaching us a little bit more and learning about your business beyond the mic, right?
Thank you so much for having me, Carly. And thank you for all of the support that you've offered me and countless others and launching our podcast. I can honestly say, I don't know if I would have been able to do it without you guys, because we would have kept dragging our feet and trying to figure out all the logistics. So thank you for demystifying some of the stuff in front of the mic, as well as all of the things behind the mic.
Amazing. Well, everyone, I hope you enjoyed the show, and we'll see you next time.